Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm going to try and explain the current situation in Britain. The pace of events, in particular, has never been so fast in my lifetime, certainly, so since the 80s. And I think that it's important to bear in mind that the global and historic situation, I would say that this, with the Brexit vote and the political explosions after, are the arrival in Britain of the kind of tumultuous events we've seen breaking out elsewhere all around the world since the crash of 2008. The global situation is one of immense instability and characterized by sharp turns and sudden changes and massive shocks in the situation. And Brexit is one of those shocks. It's symptomatic of the instability of this period, the crisis of the EU itself, and also the special crisis of British capitalism. Britain used to be known as the workshop of the world. It was known for its powerful heavy industry, in particular its steel. Now the service sector, the non-industrial sector, constitutes 78% of UK GDP, and financial services make up an extremely important part of that and of the British economy as a whole. In fact, there's been a crisis of productivity of labour in the United Kingdom, especially since the crisis in 2008. Britain is now lagging behind many of its rivals in Europe and beyond in terms of the productivity of labour and the competitiveness of British industry. And we can see this graphically with the collapse of Tata Steel. Some of the last steel plants in the UK closed down as a result of Chinese, competition, particularly from China, cheap steel, with which British capitalism simply couldn't compete. So British capitalists haven't been able to make profits out of cornering markets or investing in the development of the productive forces, and instead they have concentrated on squeezing profits through the casualisation of labour and the suppression of wages, essentially attacks on working conditions across the board. This is something that's been going on for at least the last 20 years, or probably more, and has resulted in billions of pounds being paid in tax credits. They're essentially government handouts to fill the gap in wages. In other words, bosses aren't actually paying their workers enough for them to be able to survive, feed their families, and so the government is having to hand out benefits in order to sustain them. I must point out also this was introduced by a Labour government. There was recently an investigation into a company called Sports Direct. It's a shop that sells sports clothing. During this investigation, I'll let you translate. Sports Direct employs thousands of people on what's called zero-hour contracts, temporary contracts, and staff there, it was discovered, didn't take any breaks or days off for sickness, because if they did, they'd be sacked. The situation was so bad that one person working in one of these shops had to give birth in one of the toilets because she was too afraid to go to hospital. Over 1 million people are using food banks, that's basically charitable handouts from the church, in order to feed themselves. And there is currently a very acute housing crisis, especially in London, where homelessness is increasing at the same time that billionaires are buying up much of London's more prestigious areas. There is currently a very acute housing crisis. I hope this gives you some kind of picture of the senile decay going on in the world's oldest capitalist country. It's partly as a result of this, of the changes that have occurred in Britain over the last 30 years, that the Conservative Party's social base has become increasingly narrow. It has lost almost all of its working class support in the cities, which it did have in the past, and has become almost entirely reliant on the so-called Little Englanders, often very reactionary, racist, homophobic, nationalist elements. And this layer of the Tory party membership, the majority of the Tory party membership, started to make its presence felt more and more especially through the rising influence of the UKIP party and the cries for a referendum on Europe. In order to protect his party and his seats in Parliament, David Cameron essentially had to gamble on the European referendum because of the potential threat from UKIP in the 2015 election. In this sense, Brexit is a product of an internal crisis within the Tory party. But of course, there's a bit more to it than that. Over that same period of time, the Labour Party has consistently failed to provide any alternative, either in government or in opposition, to the same Tory or Liberal policies. At the same time, the trade unions, having suffered big defeats in the 80s, were on a constant retreat, losing members and adjusting themselves to the role of constantly compromising with capitalism. It was in this context that the referendum vote occurred. On the one hand, in the Remain camp, you had austerity politicians like David Cameron, George Osborne, and the banks and big businesses who were insisting that workers vote to remain in the European Union. And with them, the Labour Party, especially the right wing, and most of the trade unions, effectively asking people to vote for a status quo which nobody liked and was actually getting worse. But on the other hand, you had a out campaign led and defined by, really, some of the most reactionary and xenophobic elements in British politics, such as Nigel Farage of the UKIP. It was essentially a fight between the sharks and the crocodiles. The result, to leave the European Union by a small majority, came as a huge shock. But it's interesting to look at the geographical layout of the vote. London voted decisively to stay in. Scotland voted decisively to stay in. Northern Ireland voted to stay in. But more or less the rest of the country voted to leave, with some of the biggest leave areas being traditionally areas of Labour Party support. There is a whole layer of the population in Britain living in former industrial centres like Sunderland in the northeast, which voted 61% to leave, which have not had any meaningful employment, for example, have been marginalised politically for decades, ignored by the Labour Party, and fed on a poisonous diet by newspapers like The Sun, for example. Brexit was effectively the revenge of this layer on the perceived establishment, but sadly without any progressive leadership on the part of Labour and the trade unions. This lashing out at the establishment has been channeled in a reactionary direction. It has caused the economic effect has been immediately pound sterling fell rapidly and has fallen now to its lowest level since 1985. The UK's credit rating has been reduced by the Moody's rating agency, meaning that it'll now be more expensive for the United Kingdom state to borrow money. Financial services are being hit, and the big bank HSBC is already talking about relocating some of its operations, which would damage the UK economy. And many commentators are predicting that a recession is likely. Credit Suisse has predicted that 500,000 jobs will be lost as a result of Brexit. Scotland and Northern Ireland, both of which voted to remain, have both called for the possibility of new referendums into independence and even Irish reunification. It is perfectly possible that the Brexit vote could result in the breakup of the United Kingdom, which would obviously be a devastating blow to British capitalism. Already we have seen immense political instability as a result of the vote. The main leaders of the Brexit camp, Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, have either resigned or retired to the background. Michael Gove and Angela Leadsom, the contenders for the Tory leadership, have been quickly dispatched, and we now have a new Prime Minister, Theresa May, a Prime Minister that no one has voted for. What is interesting about Theresa May is that even the spokespeople of the ruling class, the likes of the Financial Times newspaper, don't really know what she stands for. I've seen she's been compared to Angela Merkel, but I'll leave it to you to tell me if there are any similarities. I don't know. In her campaign speech, she's put herself forward as someone to unify her party and her country, and has used the slogan of One Nation, a traditional Tory slogan which Ed Miliband used for the Labour Party in the last election. She has dropped the commitment to eliminate the budget deficit, but still says that cuts to public spending should continue. She has said that the pay of CEOs, bosses in big companies should be published, and that employees should have representatives on the boards of companies. And she has insisted that in negotiations with the European Union about Britain's withdrawal, the question of controlling immigration will be very important. She wants to limit immigration, but at the same time, she wants to have the greatest possible access to the European market. I'm not sure what Angela Merkel will make of that. In effect, Theresa May stands for everything and nothing. She is trying to paper over the cracks in her party in order to maintain political stability. But this is impossible because her inability to stop immigration will enrage the right wing of her party, and her inability to prevent the economic consequences of Brexit will enrage British business. A split in the Tory party is still very much possible, which would be a disaster for the British ruling class, which needs, in times like this, its second 11, its B team. But at this very same time, the Labour Party, which has traditionally been its B team, is removing itself, if you like, from the control of the right wing. This is why, from the perspective of British capitalism, Jeremy Corbyn and the movement around him must be destroyed. Since his election in September as leader of the Labour Party, the party has been in a state of open civil war. To an extent, what is going on at the party base is that the right wing, the Blair right wing, if you like, still retains a great deal of control over the party structures. The overwhelming majority of councillors are currently on the right of the party and have been carrying out austerity cuts. However, since Corbyn's election, or since the beginning of the election back in the summer of last year, 400,000 people, roughly, have joined the party. Most of these people, understandably, support Corbyn. Unsurprisingly, I mean, support Corbyn. In effect, Jeremy Corbyn's standing for Labour leader and his election provided a point of reference and a focus for all of the anger and resentment and radicalisation that had been building up in British society, at least south of the Scottish border. The reason I say south of the Scottish border is because the point of reference north of the border in Scotland has been served more by the Scottish National Party and the question of national independence than by the Labour Party. So, as the comrade referred to, the struggle inside the party is taking the form of a struggle between the overwhelming majority of the parliamentary party, the MPs, and the membership at the base of the party. Politically, the Blairite wing of the party is almost indistinguishable from the Cameron wing of the Conservative Party. Under the control of the right wing, the Labour Party was responsible for the Iraq War. It introduced university fees. It started the privatisation of the NHS, and in opposition, it failed to oppose austerity in any meaningful way. They were and are horrified by Corbyn's election and will not accept it. This current coup against Corbyn is not an accident. Peter Mandelson Peter Mandelson, one of the architects of New Labour with Blair, wrote an article in the same month that Corbyn was elected, saying that party moderates, in other words, the Blairites, should wait until the party suffers any kind of defeat in elections and then stage a coup to depose him. Unfortunately for them, so far he has actually done quite well in elections, despite the overt bias of the media, who have called him things like a terrorist sympathiser, an anti-Semite, etc., based on the argument that he didn't show enough enthusiasm during the campaign. This is because he dared to say that he had issues with the European Union and the way it enforced austerity, but still supported voting in. That wasn't good enough for the Blairites. Shortly after the referendum, almost all of Corbyn's shadow cabinet resigned, and a couple of MPs submitted a motion of no confidence against him. 172 Labour MPs voted no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn. Only about 40 voted to keep him. Meanwhile, the British media was shouting about him being incompetent, unelectable, and unfit to be leader of the party. In fact, with the Tories so divided over Europe and the threat of a possible early election, although I can't say how likely, a Corbyn-led Labour Party could actually win. This is what they're scared of. Tony Blair himself has said he would rather the Labour Party lose than win with Corbyn. Blair's supporters in the party are planning to destroy it if necessary in order to save it for their own purposes and for the purposes of the ruling class. In normal conditions, Corbyn would already be gone. But he has the overwhelming support amongst the membership of the party and the backing of trade union leaders. And it's this mass pressure behind him which has given him the strength to stay so far. But despite the calls for unity on both sides and Corbyn's rhetoric about keeping calm, the clash inside the party has become extremely hostile. In Parliament, when Corbyn was making a statement about the Chilcot report into the Iraq War, a Labour MP called Ian Austin shouted, "Sit down and shut up, you're a disgrace." In fact, many Labour MPs are worried because they themselves supported the war. Meanwhile, in the local branches, for the first time in decades, perhaps ever, we have seen hundreds of people attending meetings and left-wing activists winning positions. Now the question of deselecting MPs and choosing MPs that actually reflect the wishes of the leadership is starting to assert itself more and more. Now there is going to be a new leadership election. The right wing tried to avoid having an election with Corbyn in it because they knew that if he was, he would win again. First, they tried to force him to resign, to bully him to resign, but that didn't work. Then they tried to keep him off the ballot for the leadership election by a bureaucratic manoeuvre, saying that he had to first gain the support of 51 Labour MPs. You've timed your meeting well, because had it been last night, we wouldn't have known the result of this, but we do now. The party's ruling body has decided that Corbyn will be automatically placed on the ballot, and the Blairites are devastated. They've called it the end of the party, which may be true for them. The NEC, the ruling body, also made another decision, which was that only party members who joined more than 6 months ago can vote in the election, which means that over 100,000 people who joined, mostly to support Corbyn, won't have a vote. In addition, to register as a supporter in order to vote, you must pay £25, which is unaffordable for many poor workers. It's a deliberate attempt to keep as many Corbyn supporters off out of the election as possible. Finally, it decided to shut down all local party branches until September. The reason for this, I suspect, is that the local party branch of one of the contenders, Angela Eagle in Wallasey, has put forward a motion of no confidence in her. So now they won't be able to discuss this motion, but this will not get rid of any of the anger directed at the MPs responsible for this coup. Ordinary people, ordinary Labour Party members, are absolutely furious at the MPs responsible for the coup. If Corbyn wins, and he probably will, then the struggle within the party, which is essentially a fundamental class struggle going on, will be brought to its climax. This is because many of the members will want to choose MPs who actually represent the party, and many of the MPs would rather split the party than lose their seats. Just to finish on Corbyn's programme, in addition to his economic demands, he is very anti-war, he is against nuclear weapons, he wants Britain to withdraw from NATO. He also is a staunch supporter of Palestinian liberation, of Cuba, and of Venezuela. You can imagine this means he is hated by the British establishment. An unnamed general in the British Army said that the army would mutiny, it would essentially rebel, if Corbyn were to come to power and try to get rid of Trident, the nuclear weapons in Britain. What we're seeing here is an open admission that ultimately the interests of British imperialism, or what's left of it, trump any kind of democratic process in the election of a government, which isn't entirely surprising, but it also raises the genuine possibility of some form of military coup and anti-democratic action at some point in the future. It shows how serious the crisis is. What is not clear is how Corbyn would or could respond to that. That is why I believe that it's absolutely necessary to be able to build a revolutionary Marxist force alongside and within this movement. On the question of what causes the unions to be so firm, I think that's a very good question. And actually, I think the union leaders themselves would like to know the answer to this question, because up until now they've been pathetically weak. The simple and very general answer to this question is that a fundamental shift has taken place in British society. To concretise that, Corbyn, when he first stood for election, said that he didn't expect to win and he just wanted to extend the debate. When he won, it was even suggested that even if he won, he would stand down because he's too old for someone else with similar politics. This was before hundreds of thousands of people, particularly young people, poured into this movement and demanded that he provide this alternative they've been looking for. Initially, the trade union leaders had supported another candidate, Andy Burnham, who is seen as, I suppose, in the centre of the party, whatever that means. Now, the same people like Len McCluskey, who's the leader of the largest union in Britain, Unite, are describing the coup against Corbyn as a squalid coup and describing Labour Party MPs as, I think it's sordid plotters, using very hostile language. Even David Prentice, who's the General Secretary of Unison, who is a very right-wing union General Secretary, has come out in support of Corbyn. People like Len McCluskey and Dave Prentice can feel the pressure coming from the lower ranks of their union, the mass base of their union, and feel they have to respond to that. They have to challenge that. Challenge. In other words, both Corbyn and the unions are. It's like they're on the crest of a wave. This gigantic social force is pushing them forward and forward again, and they are having to respond to it each time. I believe that if this mass support had not been there, then Corbyn would have resigned because he has been under enormous pressure. But if you have hundreds of thousands of people attending rallies and demonstrations, protesting outside party headquarters, pouring into Labour branches and passing motions of supporting you, then that probably gives you a lot more confidence, I would imagine. The problem is, it appears that Corbyn is responding to many of the attacks from the right wing in an empirical way, by which I mean the problem of deselection and of the right wing MPs has still not been resolved. Yes, this is how it's working out, but prior to this, ever since Jeremy Corbyn's election as Labour leader, the intentions of the right wing, that effectively the refusal to act, to work under him, has been clear. Corbyn, I think, did something very good and wise in that he and people around him set up a body called Momentum, an organisation in order to organise all of his supporters. This is something I support. My criticism of it is that unfortunately, at the start at least, it was run by people who had been appointed and not elected. It was unclear what it represented, really, and it spent a lot of its time telling the members to calm down, if you like, and to tone down their demands. The decision to do this was a tactical one. It was intended to foster as much unity as possible to try and win round the rebel MPs in order to avoid conflict, or at least save the conflict for a more favourable time. But unfortunately, as has happened many times in history, if anything, it had the same effect. As we say, weakness invites aggression. Still today, many of the people I speak to who support Corbyn through and through are still not involved in Momentum or the Labour Party. And this is something that has to change, really. The only way these people, and I'm particularly young people who haven't been involved in the party or Momentum before, are going to be won to getting involved and getting organised is on the basis of a perspective for struggling to reclaim the Labour Party in full and also for socialist change. That's what's been lacking up until this point. With this coup, it has completely transformed the situation because without any leadership coming from Momentum, say, the masses, the hundreds of thousands of people who support Corbyn have acted on their own behalf. Jeremy Corbyn and Momentum never asked them to raise motions or threaten to deselect MPs. In fact, people have been learning from experience the last couple of weeks and have learned some very big lessons. And now, as a result of this, the prospect of deselecting these MPs is looking more and more achievable, which is fantastic. I would point out one technical point, that the boundaries for constituencies in Britain are going to be changed, which means there's going to be a number of reselection contests anyway. There has to be. Also, during the discussion, I received an email telling me that the CWU union, the Communication Workers Union in Bristol, has withdrawn support and funding for its 3 Labour MPs in the area because they took part in the coup against Corbyn. In effect, with this desperate coup, the Blairites have pushed this to the point of no return. I would say that now is the time, more than ever, for the left, for Corbyn and Momentum, to go onto the offensive and finish the job. At the moment, meetings are suspended because of the election contest, so obviously the trigger ballots can't happen now. But what we can do is prepare politically and look at the question of left candidates, etc. So we're ready. Finally, on the comrade's question about the meeting, the NEC meeting, it's true that Corbyn and all his supporters were present for the vote on whether he'll be on the ballot, and then he and a couple of supporters left. It was after that point that they held the votes on the cut-off date for registration and for the cost of supporters. The problem is, for the right wing, that first of all, this cheap trick has infuriated the membership even more. Even worse, Unite, the biggest union in Britain, has opened up its what it calls community membership, which is a cheap membership for £2 a month. And if people join that way, then they can still vote in the election. So now we have hundreds of thousands of Corbyn supporters all joining a union in order to then still be able to vote for Corbyn. There's a quote from Marx which comes to mind, that sometimes the whip of counter-revolution can spur the workers on. Here in Britain, the reactionary attempts of the Blairites to depose Corbyn and to keep voters off the ballot has resulted in probably the biggest rise in trade union and Labour Party membership in the last 30 years. And these new Labour Party and union members are extremely angry, extremely radical, and want to get rid of them. It's almost like the Blairites are a bigger threat to themselves than Corbyn. In this kind of situation, anything can happen. This is why I believe that even revolutionary events, upheavals, are perfectly possible in the coming period. But there is still a long way to go. I mean, the very short answer is no, I don't think another EU is possible. The reasons for this, I'll try to be brief. The reason for this is throughout its entire history, the EU has been characterized as an imperialist alliance focused on the improvement, if you like, of the exploitation of the European and world working class for European business. During times of boom and success for European capitalism, it has offered a number of reforms and benefits to workers in the most wealthy European countries, at least. But now, in conditions of extreme capitalist crisis, this process is turning into its opposite, and many of these benefits or rights are being taken away. We saw this most graphically in Greece, where rights like working time legislation, trade union protection have just been disapplied in order to apply austerity. So the only way to change the dynamic of European integration, which I consider to be a historical necessity, would be to remove or resolve the crisis of capitalism, which is creating this monstrous austerity. The institutions of the European Union, the European Parliament, the Commission, the Euro, the ECB are incapable of providing this change, unfortunately. In fact, the only way we can achieve this, the integration of the people and resources of Europe on a truly democratic basis, is the socialist transformation of society. I believe in a socialist United States of Europe, not a capitalist EU. And I suppose I'll finish there. Please, I don't want any European comrades to be disheartened by Brexit. The workers of Britain haven't turned away from you. It just proves that in order for any of us to be successful, we are going to have to work together to overthrow capitalism as a whole in Europe and worldwide. And I'll finish there. Thank you.